Hello my beautiful watchers and welcome back to Lost in Adaptation. So, my first ever episode involving 2 or more movies based on a single book that's not a reboot. I had a bit of trouble deciding how I was going to go about doing this. I always intended to do separate episodes for each film, but for example, if they include something from the second half of the book in the first film, should that count as a change? What I eventually decided on was small details and things like character backstories, development and exposition should be fair game for whichever movie wants them as long as the events of the story still follow the same timeline. So, without further ado, Mockingjay, Part 1.
Are you coming to the tree? They strung up a man, they say we were free. Strange things that happened here, stranger would it be? We left at midnight in the hanging tree.
Released in 2014, Mockingjay Part 1 continued the winning streak of box office success, but critical reception was tempered somewhat by the decision to split the film, leaving an abundance of setup and not very much payoff. Now I know it's become my routine to describe my thoughts on the book just as a book first, but I'm gonna have to save that for Part 2 on this one. All I can say for now is this series did not stick the landing. Anyways, for now, here's my thoughts on the film just as a film. Once again, I find myself in agreement with the film's critics. I'm not, as a general rule, particularly pleased with this whole Part 1, Part 2 thing Harry Potter, amongst others, made so popular. While I openly acknowledge that fitting everything that was in the book into the relatively much shorter runtime of a film is usually the first and sometimes biggest hurdle the adapters have to face, in this case it's been clearly proven by the first 2 movies that these books fit very neatly into a 2-hour runtime without the need to cut anything significant out. So, why do it here? Well, I hate to be cynical, but I can't help but feel it was all about the dollar. It's not massively more expensive to film a really long movie and then cut it in 2, and assuming they both do well, you have the potential to double your profits. From a fiscal perspective, it's a win-win no-brainer. The only drawback, and I realise this seems so obvious it shouldn't even be worth mentioning, but the filmmakers seem to have conveniently forgotten it, is half a story is not a story. Now, of course, I'm not saying you can't have a film that's just one piece of a larger, overarching story, because that's the basic nature of any trilogy, but that's not what Suzanne Collins had in mind for the narrative of Mockingjay. If it was, she would have written 2 bloody books for it. Okay, enough about that for now. I'm also keen to mention something that's been bothering me since film 1, namely the ridiculous way Katniss always pulls back her bowstring a good 10 to 15 seconds before she shoots. Now, I'm no expert on archery, but even I know this means either A, Katniss's muscles of pure titanium, in which case I don't know why she's even bothering with a bow in the first place, she could just rip people in 2, or B, the draw weight on all of her bows has been so laughable her arrows should have been bouncing off anyone wearing thick clothing. I also noticed the Peacekeepers have pretty much become carbon copies of Stormtroopers at this point, managing to miss people climbing trees at virtually point-blank range, and the revelation that their fully enclosing helmets still leave them vulnerable to gas attacks. These things aside, I will say the directing in Mockingjay Part 1 is still leagues better than the original Hunger Games, and even being half a story, the grandiose nature of the start of this all-out war in Panem makes it seem a lot more epic than Catching Fire, whose only real stakes involve the self-preservation of the leads. Mockingjay Part 1 is not a bad movie. It's not a great movie, but despite its fractured nature, I'd say it's got a decent chance of being allowed to hang with the cool kids in the Hunger Games school reunion. In keeping with its predecessors, this film stuck to the storyline of the book so closely a description of its likenesses is pretty much indistinguishable from a long synopsis of the plot. Picking up pretty much straight away where the last film left off, Katniss Everdeen, survivor now of 2 consecutive Hunger Games as a refugee in the until recently believed destroyed District 13, a predominantly military district that has kept the capital at bay for decades with a nuclear deterrent. They're quite keen for her to cash in on the countrywide popularity she's earned recently in the games to become the propaganda figurehead known as the Mockingjay. Named such because these birds have become the symbol of rebellion and unite all the districts together against the oppressive capital. Unfortunately, recent events, namely her being forced to murder multiple people, followed by Peter being taken captive by the capital, and the complete destruction of her home, District 12, have left her too psychologically exhausted to fulfill this role. This changes when the capital starts forcing Peter to appear in their news broadcasts encouraging a ceasefire, much to the disgust of the residents of 13. Realizing this could be grounds for him to be punished after the war, Katniss agrees to become the Mockingjay only on the proviso that Peter and the other victims of the Hunger Games be granted immunity for spouting the capital's nonsense. The president of District 13, a woman named Coin, reluctantly agrees to her terms. Katniss then discovers that her beloved and very talented stylist Cinna designed her some Mockingjay-themed body armor before his execution in the capital. His last request was apparently that she not be shown it unless she chose the role for herself. They start trying to film the promos in a studio, but this goes very badly as it turns out Katniss is only inspiring when she's in a genuine life or death situation. The only option is to send her out into the field. They choose District 8 as the fighting there appears to be winding down. Pausing for just a second here, I'd like to point out something funny. I recently rewatched that weird advert for Mockingjay where all those District 13 soldiers wearing white uniform do that synchronized gun dance while Katniss wanders through them, and it looked exactly like the kind of thing they would have tried in one of those stupid fake promos they attempted before Hamish turned up and schooled them. I don't know if that was an intentional nod to that bit of the story, but it's kind of hilarious. Anyways, getting back to the story, Katniss visits a makeshift hospital full of wounded rebels and civilians, and the effect she has on them is just as awe-inspiring as 13 was hoping. Just as they're getting ready to leave, a wing of Capital hovercraft arrive and bomb the hospital to smithereens. Enraged by this, Katniss uses her new high-tech bow and explosive arrows to bring down the attackers. She then makes the genuinely inspiring speech they were going for in the first place. Slightly later, Peter is forced back on camera by the Capitol, showing signs of extreme physical stress and abuse. The rebels interrupt the broadcast, showing Peter footage of Katniss. This snaps him out of it long enough for him to warn her there's a Capitol attack on the way. District 13 leaps into action and moves everyone into deep underground bunkers, rendering the attack relatively harmless. During their time down there, Katniss finally realizes that Snow is torturing and corrupting Peter specifically to get to her, so he won't stop while she's still alive. This unbalances her to the point that she can no longer concentrate on the Mockingjay facade. To try to bring her back around, 13 launches a stealthy rescue mission into the Capitol to get Peter and the other hostages like Finnick's girlfriend. The mission is successful, possibly too much so. The other shoe unfortunately drops when Peter attempts to murder Katniss. It turns out he's been subjected to a process known as hijacking. He was injected with hallucinatory and fear-inducing drugs and conditioned to hate and fear what he formerly loved. Okay, onto the details they adhered to from the book. The explanation that District 13 was so keen to welcome newcomers was because a large part of their population had been killed or made infertile by a recent epidemic. The Hanging Tree song, though there was a slight change to the original lyrics. I actually quite liked the way they worked in Peter's Always line by doing a recreation of the scene from the train in Catching Fire, but in a District 13 setting. I wasn't sure how they were going to do this as they skipped over the original setup for that line in the last book. I also thought they might have been tempted to cut it out altogether so Severus Snape wouldn't sue them. I was also really impressed with the way they handled Peter's descent into physical desolation. The makeup aside, did that poor actor starve himself for like a month or what? Big props for the commitment, bro. Katniss's film crew, former Capitol residents who willingly fled to join the rebels, are accurate to the book right down to Pollux being an Avox. I wasn't sure if they were going to stick to that as they hadn't bothered to establish Avoxes in the first two films. President Snow's recurring rose theme, although he didn't just stick to white in the book. I wasn't surprised to see that they included a mention of Snow's never-healing mouth sores gained over years of drinking poison with his enemies after taking a not quite sufficient antidote beforehand because they established them with the bloody backwash in Catching Fire. I really should have mentioned this in the last episode, but that was a clever substitution for the smell of blood that was on his breath that almost overwhelmed Katniss whenever they met. Yet again, I find myself forced to abandon entire pages of similarities so we can move on to the next section. My apologies. The start of the film showing Katniss hiding in parts of 13 she shouldn't be in, her degraded psychological state and her lackluster approach to the war in general is technically accurate to the story, but is mentioned only as backstory in the book, which officially starts with her mid-solo visit to the torched remains of District 12. Film Katniss seems to have forgotten book Katniss's final demand of "I get to be the one to kill Snow," possibly to make the line "my sister gets to keep her cat" funnier. If that is the reason, it's a stupid one. Praise the Lord, I finally get a decent change to talk about. Thank you, Effie Trinket, for crowbarring yourself back into this story. Okay, I'm gonna need to backpedal a little bit here because I've stupidly neglected to mention Katniss's prep team until now. Flavius, Octavia, and Venia, Cinna's sidekicks and Katniss's hair, skin, nails, and makeup stylists. They follow a story arc not dissimilar to Effie's in that they originally spend most of their time off in the clouds thinking the world is made of sunshine and rainbows and talking about minor ass shit going on in the Capitol. However, when Katniss is forced back into the games in Catching Fire, they can't help but feel the tragic unfairness of the situation. While they didn't have anywhere near as big a part in the films as they did in the books, their existence was at least acknowledged, so I didn't think them important enough to be worth covering. However, what I, and apparently the filmmakers, didn't consider is that they have a much bigger part in Mockingjay, and without their character development from the first and second books, it was going to be really hard to work them into this film's story. Their solution was to cut them out altogether and hand their roles over to a character who was developed a bit more in the films, and conveniently was written out almost entirely in the last book. Effie never set foot in District 13 in the original story. All the stuff about her rescue versus kidnapping and having to adapt to life in 13 originally happened to the prep team, not her. Because of this, you don't see the unpleasant manner in which Katniss originally found her old friends, i.e. chained to a wall and covered in their own shit in the bowels of District 13. Due to their pampered Capitol upbringing, they just hadn't been able to take the repeated warnings from District 13 security seriously and had tried to take extra food on multiple occasions, resulting in this very harsh punishment. Katniss theorizes that she was allowed to discover them in this condition as a message from President Coin, who had not liked having her hand forced in the Mockingjay negotiations. The significance of this is it's one of the first big signs that maybe this supposedly good president has more in common with old Snow than she would have people believe. Just in case you were wondering, Miss Trinket's original story was the Capitol threw her in prison at the start of the war for her association to Katniss, but ultimately this worked out quite well for her as it endeared her to the victorious rebels. In the book, District 13's hovercraft all had cloaking devices. I don't know, I just thought that was pretty neat. At first I was confused as to why they gave Gale a crossbow instead of a bow in the film. Then I realised I hadn't actually seen Gale with a bow in the first or second movies, so... retroactively, I should mention that Gale is a talented archer too in the books. I guess they wanted to make that more of Katniss's unique skill. Katniss running away from her squad in District 8 is tweaked slightly to seem less like an intentional act of defiance, with her getting split off from them by falling rubble. In the book, Gale has to break Boggs' nose so she can run back to the hospital and take down the hovercraft. Everyone, including Boggs, lies to cover up for her afterwards, making him seem like a pretty awesome dude. The only person who really doesn't take it well is Hamish, who took great exception to her pulling her earpiece out so she could ignore him. He threatens to lock her into a headset that's more akin to a medieval torture device if she does it again. The air raid evacuation of District 13's populace to their underground bunker and the following weathering of the bombing is reasonably accurate in regards to things like Prim going back for her cat and how claustrophobic things got down there, but it was made significantly more dramatic than how things went down in the book. In the book, thanks to Peter's warning, everyone was already deep underground before the bombs started falling. Having them start early, I guess, made things more exciting, but excitement was not, in my opinion, the theme of that particular part of the novel. Ominous dread and fear was. And while we're on this subject, what was with those stupid sprinklers going off? Leaving aside how much more dangerous they made things by making the stairs all slippery, why the fuck would a stairwell made of stone and metal need water sprinklers in the first place? And on top of all that, the film added in cracks appearing in the ceiling of this supposedly atomic bomb-proof bunker. Oh well. Moving on to a rather depressing subject, one that has fortunately not, to my uncertain knowledge, come up in many of the films I've covered thus far on the show. Something happened that could have drastically affected the adaptation process that was not a creative choice, nor a budgetary constraint, or a failure of talent. Something that was 100% out of the control of the author, the writers, and the director. During the filming of Mockingjay, Philip Seymour Hoffman, the actor playing Plutarch Heavensbee, tragically died, robbing the film of a character who, if not quite key, was at least very prominent. According to interviews with the director and the producer, there were only 2 scenes left unfilmed that he was intended to fill a main role in, and they decided to give his parts over to other characters as opposed to attempting to use digital effects to superimpose him back in. Speaking in regards to just part 1 for now, I can't think of any particular scenes from the book involving him that were omitted, making it likely that the missing scenes were intended to be more embellishments of the character. So, while the loss of human life and acting talent cannot be understated, the effect on the film as an adaptation was ultimately minimal. Now usually the what they left out altogether section would be next, but honestly there's just not enough stuff worth talking about there, so please welcome back... Sorry to keep repeating myself in every episode, but once again, any scene that you saw that did not directly involve Katniss Everdeen, the person from whose perspective you view the world in the books, was either not in the book or only described to her secondhand. In this film, this becomes a little bit more prominent as there's more characters for us to follow than just President Snow, but I once again maintain that this film does not abuse this privilege. All the scenes they added in tie directly into the book's plot. In the book, Katniss assumes that Snow didn't know that she was in District 8, hence why he targeted the hospital instead of her. However, the film's choice to show that Snow knew full well that she was there, but was choosing to let the world know that it was bad for your health to associate with the Mockingjay, instead of risking showing the districts how desperate he was to get rid of her in an attempt that might fail, makes just as much sense, and doesn't contradict the book because Katniss has no idea about any of it. The same applies to President Coin deciding to just weather the Capitol's bombing instead of giving away the strength of 13's defenses, showing the people of the various districts being inspired by Katniss's videos to start fighting back, and showing the details of the rescue mission in the Capitol at the end. All of these scenes walk the fine line between embellishing the story and staying true to it, and I think they did it really well. I might even go as far as to say that they were the best part of the whole damn movie. So as you can imagine, the biggest and most obvious problem with only adapting part of a book is the lack of finale for the first half. Some part of the middle of the book, originally intended to simply be the humble end of a single chapter or act, has to step up and become the climactic end of the film. In the case of Mockingjay, they chose the before mentioned rescue of Peter and the other tributes being held in the Capitol. Originally, Katniss never really learnt all the details of the mission, she just helps Finnick out with a distracting broadcast and then waits for them to get back. All the suspenseful drama of Gale and the others flying in under the radar, infiltrating the building, the power coming back on suddenly, and the horror of when it looked like the jig was up and they weren't going to make it out is most definitely lacking in the book. Again though, it's arguably the best part of the film, and it's all stuff that could have happened in the book. However, there's another part of it that I can't say the same thing about. The problem the filmmakers had was that Katniss, the hero of the story, was not directly involved in this particular endeavour, and you can't just round off a movie without the lead contributing something. The workaround they came up with involved involved making up a scene where Katniss has to keep Beedee's jamming signal open by personally tempting President Snow into engaging her in conversation. This way, she got to play a key role in the rescue, even if the whole thing turned out to be part of Snow's master plan anyway. The Dom's final thoughts. Honestly, as half an adaptation goes, this really isn't too bad. Yes, it got a bit boring in places and the ending suffered for lack of epicness, but overall it could have been much worse. I still say it was a stupid and greedy idea to split this story up, but the film stuck to the first half of the book so well, I guess I should give it the same sort of leeway I afforded the Neverending Story, which, let's face it, did pretty much the same thing, but without a part 2. So, 3 of the 4 movies down without any overly offensive deviations from the book's plot. Please join me next time, beautiful watchers, to see if they managed to make it a full set. Hey beautiful watchers, just the usual reminder that, if you're interested, there's lots of fun ways to get involved with the show when you become a Patreon supporter. Please stop that, Miss Everdeen. Also, if you'd be so good as to share this video on Facebook and Twitter, that's a big boost to helping me reach more audiences. Might I also encourage you to subscribe to my channel if you enjoyed this video, because, as everyone on the internet knows, the more subscribers you have, the more you know, matter. Thanks for joining me, my beautiful... Okay, excuse me just a moment. You're gonna get it now, girl!